You're listening to the Veteran Next Door Radio.
WNFC, Knoxville, KFEZ, Colorado Springs.
This is the Veteran Next Door Network.
Stay tuned for another exciting story about American veterans as told by the veterans themselves and hosted by Randy Baxter, the host of the Veteran Next Door.
The Veteran Next Door. Here's your host, Randall Baxter.
You're listening to The Veteran Next Door, and I'm your host, Randy Baxter. Today I'm going to tell you a story. Recently I had made a trip up into Appleton, Wisconsin, up near Oshkosh and Green Bay. And while I was there, I went into an antique store and I saw a couple of newspapers from the Milwaukee Journal. And they were old and faded. And the one that was on the top was dated Tuesday, October 27th, 1942. And I looked at it, and the cost of the newspaper was 3 cents. And it had so many interesting articles on the front page, I just had to have it. By the way, the 3-cent newspaper cost me $16. But when I finally got it out of its plastic wrapper and I opened it up, first thing I wanted to do was just kind of glance through it. And I noticed that inside it were some pretty neat ads. One was from Clode's Interior Decorators. They had 3 leather-topped wooden tables that fit. The smaller one fit inside the middle one, and the middle one sat inside the bigger one. So you could have 3 tables or one. They had leather tops. The cost was $35. And on into the newspaper, McNeil and Moore, they had a gabardine all-weather great coat for a man, 100% wool, $75. And Kunzelman and Esser had an occasional chair with wood curved arms that you might see in a real nice lawyer's office, $12.95. Philip Morris had an ad, and it said, "You're safer with Philip Morris. Our cigarettes are scientifically proved to be less irritating." And then another ad by a company called Schuster's had a twin raccoon skin all wool ladies coat, $59.95. And you could buy an asbestos blanket for your hot water heater for $3.98. And at Gimbel's, sofa bed, nice, $37.95. Or 5-way curtains, 90 inches long and 90 inches wide, for $2.45. Sears had an ad in here. You can get a 1- or 2-piece snowsuit for your baby. Wool, $1.98. Coca-Cola, a nickel. Parkway Liquor store in Milwaukee had Hiram Walker whiskey, 1 quart, $1.89. And J.C. Penney had a wooden playpen for your baby, $6.90. Advertisements in the paper for coal per ton, $8.60, but if you wanted a full stove size, it was $10.30 a ton. Boston Men's Store, wool jackets, $3.99. And there was an announcement that coffee rationing was about to begin. And then I started looking through the paper, not at the ads, but at the photos. I turned on page 3, and there was a picture of American officers interrogating a captured Japanese soldier on Henderson Field. A couple pages later, a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt was talking to American ladies in England who were operating the ferries across the rivers. And another one of 4 British soldiers looking at a dead German soldier in North Africa. And on the page next to it, Heinrich Himmler with his arms crossed. He just looked so angry. He was the Gestapo chief. His arms were folded in disgust as he surveyed damage from a raid by the Royal Air Force in Germany. 2 brothers and their cousin, all born on the same day, enlisted in the Army Air Corps as mechanics. And then I went back to the front page again to see what kind of stories were in the newspaper. President Roosevelt had just signed a bill for $15 billion. Doesn't sound like much in today's trillions, does it? To go to the Navy. The Navy was to use that for whatever they needed, and an aircraft carrier at the time only cost about $20,737,000. Congress, in one article, was debating the issues of trying to decide, were they going to lower the draft age from 20 to 18? And they did decide that they were going to abolish poll taxes for the federal elections. And they were ready to mobilize the nation's manpower for an all-out war effort. The British Army, in one article on the front page, was reported as cutting through the German minefields in Africa. And one Milwaukee Journal writer wrote a story about a flight from Australia to New Guinea where nobody in the plane had parachutes except the crew. There was another article of American musicians who had gone to Australia to entertain the troops. And oh, by the way, they were in uniform too. The Wisconsin public employees were asking for a raise, citing all the inflation. Their opponents made public that the cost of bacon had gone down. And those were all interesting stories. I enjoyed reading them all. But the headline said something very, very special. It was October 27th, and the headline said, "Sea air battle rages near the Solomons. The carrier Wasp lost September 15th. And that's our story today. You're listening to The Veteran Next Door, and I'm your host, Randy Baxter, and we'll be right back.
The Veteran Next Door will return in a moment.
In 1942, we had 7 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The Lexington, the Yorktown, the Hornet, the Enterprise, the Ranger, the Saratoga, and the Wasp. Lexington, we had lost in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Yorktown, we lost in the Battle of Midway. Before the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Ranger and the Saratoga were far away being repaired. And what you're about to hear is the story of the Wasp, the day it was sunk. And it was a quiet day when it started out. It was dawn. On September 15, 1942, the United States had 4 active fleet aircraft carriers at the time, But again, like I said, the Enterprise and the Saratoga were damaged and undergoing repairs. The other two were the Hornet and the Wasp, but they were in submarine-infested waters off the eastern Solomon Islands, supporting the Navy's first attempt to land a large number of marine reinforcements on Guadalcanal's beleaguered Lunga perimeter. They were trying to reinforce the Marines who were holding Henderson Field. So by noon that day, the troop convoy was sighted by a Japanese patrol bomber, which turned away in fear that it would be attacked. And at that moment, Task Force 61, carriers Wasp and Hornet, in a surface force that included battleships North Carolina and Washington, were about 100 miles from the transports, just below the 12th parallel, about 250 miles southeast of Guadalcanal's Marine-held Henderson Field. Routine anti-submarine and combat air patrols were aloft, and at 2:20 p.m., the Wasp turned northeastward into the wind and launched the first of 14 SBD Dauntless dive bombers to search 200 miles out in the direction of Guadalcanal. 4 additional SBDs were added to the inner air patrol, and 8 F-4F Wildcat fighters were sent up to relieve the combat air patrol. Those boys on that ship were busy. Most of the other strike aircraft aboard Wasp and Hornet were ready or being ready to launch in the event Japanese warships were found. So they were launching planes, and then they were stopping, and they were landing planes, and they were moving them downstairs on the elevators. Everybody on that ship was working. And as soon as the launch was completed, the Wasp recovered 8 fighters and 3 dive bombers. As soon as the Wasp came to her new heading, the captain ordered 16 fighters to be respotted for takeoff, and all dive bombers struck below to the hangar deck of the small fleet carrier. All aircraft were fully armed. The dive bombers and fighters that had just landed were being taken down to the hangar deck on the midships elevator to be refueled. Additional fighters were being brought up to the flight deck on the same elevator. No time was being wasted. But it was a beautiful day. The sky was breathtakingly clear, and visibility was unlimited. If there was any worry at all, it was over the condition of the sea. A 20-knot trade wind blowing up from the southeast had covered the surface with whitecaps, which were perfect concealment for the relays of submarines that had been dogging the carriers nearly every day since the Saratoga had been struck by a torpedo 2 weeks earlier. But there was nothing that could be done beyond keeping search pilots, lookouts, and sonar men at a high state of alert. And indeed they should have been, for Japanese Commander Takichi Kanashi, captain of Fleet Submarine I-19, had been tracking a sea full of fat targets for hours, and now he finally fell heir to a clear shot at one of 2 American aircraft carriers. At 2:45 p.m., only a minute after I-19 fired the last of its 6 torpedoes, Wasp gunnery officer Lieutenant Commander George Knupfer was standing his routine afternoon watch in the Sky Control Station, high up in the trip mast over the bridge, when his assistant, who was placed well to starboard, blurted out, "You're listening to The Veteran Next Door, and we'll be right back."
The Veteran Next Door will return in a moment.
First torpedo buckled the flight deck. Flames shot up from the starboard side. The second torpedo blew open the hatch over elevator 1, the forward elevator, and flames belched out of the elevator shaft. Elevator 2, which was caught at flight deck level, was severely buckled. Light bulbs in compartments throughout the ship were blown out. Fixtures were blasted loose, and a great mixed volume of glass, gear, and papers were thrown to the deck, along with virtually every man aboard who was standing. All hands climbed back to their feet, and they were felled again by another violent detonation. A third torpedo had broached the waves, but had plunged on to strike the side of the ship about 60 feet forward of the bridge and quite near the surface. Damage above the waterline, particularly to anti-aircraft guns mounted along the starboard catwalks, it was considerable. None of the men in the forward starboard 5-inch gun gallery had been hurt when the second torpedo detonated almost directly beneath their feet. But a significant number of gunners were overcome by noxious fumes thrown off in the wake of the third torpedo detonations. At the instant the first torpedo struck, about 60 plane handlers, armorers, and mechanics were working on the hangar deck forward of Elevator 2. Remember how I told you how busy they were? The hangar deck was made an instant shambles by the sheer force of the first two torpedo detonations. The second blast was accompanied by a sheet of flames that seemed to engulf the entire starboard side of the forward half of the enclosed cavernous work area. Several sailors jumped overboard to escape the flames, and at least one man was blown over the side. Thick, dark smoke instantly permeated the entire work area. Many planes were lifted up and bounced down with such force as to shatter their landing gears. At least two of the front spare Wildcats lashed to the overhead of the hangar deck were jarred loose from their bindings and fell on the planes below them. The result was an impenetrable mass of aircraft scrap and armaments that could not be moved from the soup of aviation gasoline leaking into the ruptured aircraft fuel tanks. Water pressure was nil. Two men who tried to start the water were trapped by the flames and could only save themselves by taking a circuitous and arduous path to the fantail. Captain Sherman ordered the ship slowed to 10 knots and the rudder put hand hard to the left. Next, he backed the ship at full right rudder to get the wind to blow the flames from and smoke away from the undamaged portion of the ship. The fire was beginning to build, black smoke getting so hard to breathe that sailors were collapsing. A fire-induced explosion on the powder hoist to one of the starboard 5-inch guns blew the gun mount up into the flight deck and the splinter shield into the water. Fires were raging virtually out of control in many below-deck spaces along the starboard side of the ship. Many men were simply consumed in leapfrogging flash fires, while others succumbed to smoke and other hazards as they groped through escape routes that were often cut off by the effects of the torpedo detonations and numerous secondary blasts. It had only been 10 minutes. The torpedoes had struck the carrier while she was most vulnerable, when airplanes were in the hangar deck being refueled. Thus, highly volatile aviation gasoline was flowing freely through a maze of pipes throughout the vicinity of all three torpedo hits. Nothing could have been more catastrophic. Nearly everyone who was working or resting below decks at the time of the torpedo hits reported smelling gasoline vapors. The detonation of these volatile vapors caused an extremely violent, sympathetic explosion at about 3:05 p.m. So time out. Did you hear that word, sympathetic explosion? I had to look it up. A sympathetic detonation is also called a flashover. It's a detonation, usually unintended, of an explosive charge by a nearby explosion. Sympathetic detonation is caused by shock wave or impact of primary or secondary blast fragments. Sympathetic detonations present problems in storage and transport of explosions and ordnance. Sufficient spacing between adjacent stacks of explosive materials has to be maintained. In case of an accidental detonation of one charge, other ones in the same container or dump can be detonated as well, but the explosion should not spread to other storage units unless the fire is so great and the explosion so many that it sets a chain reaction. For the Wasp, the sympathetic explosion was fatal. It wasn't the torpedoes. It was the internal explosions being set off by all the fire and the detonation of the torpedoes. The Wasp was thus doomed more by secondary gasoline fires than she was by the considerable direct, vast structural damage caused by the torpedo detonations against her hull. Within only a minute of the last torpedo blast, the entire forward end of the hangar deck was a raging inferno, and the surviving hangar deck crew had completely run out of ways to fight the fire. The danger was compounded by thousands of rounds of .30 caliber and .50 caliber machine gun ammunition now cooking off in the airplanes stowed forward at Elevator 2. One sailor under orders was told to pick up some ammunition and throw it overboard. And on his way to the side of the ship, he suffered a sympathetic explosive death. Exploding bombs and airplane fuel tanks added to the carnage and constantly bowled over the men trying to put out the fire. Flames spreading among the paint on the bulkheads and the overhead added considerable fuel to the fire. The Wasp was one of the few ships that had not taken all the paint off, so that the metal on the side of the ship had actually caught on fire. The paint was burning. The sheer magnitude of the sympathetic blast caused by the detonation of fuel vapors and leaking fuel itself felled nearly every firefighter on the hangar deck. Many of the survivors credit Lieutenant Raleigh Kirkpatrick's stand against the flames at Elevator 2 with preserving viable escape routes and for saving the ship from being consumed even more rapidly than it was. He did that by shutting the doors to keep the flames out of the non-burning areas, but when he did so, he locked some sailors out. As relays of firefighters and volunteers held the flames at bay, large groups moved to the extremities of the ship and formed orderly lines to await the opportunity to climb into the water. Not everyone left their station, however. The ship's dentist was too busy treating wounded in the isolated forecastle to heed or order to go to safety. He breathed in so much smoke and passed out. They took him ashore, and he later died of smoke inhalation. Lieutenant Commander Knooper, we heard about him a minute ago, oversaw the rigging of many lines over the side of the ship, for the abandonment was proceeding at far too slow a pace given the rate of the advancing flames. When an insufficiency of life jackets materialized, Lieutenant Knooper sent volunteers to the nearby Marine Detachment's berthing compartment to fetch mattresses and pillows, which were passed out or thrown overboard to swimmers. Many men in the water were threatened, and some were killed by burning fuel oil. The ship was drifting, and even the non-burning oil slick presented navigational and health risks to the hundreds of tired and shocked survivors. Everyone who could pulled for the safety of clear seas and 5 nearby destroyers which had lowered whaleboats. Orders came at 4:55 p.m., 2 hours after the torpedoes hit, to sink what remained of the Wasp fire-gutted hulk and torpedoes. At 9 p.m., September 15th, 1942, USS Wasp, America's 7th fleet carrier, completed her long roll to starboard and disappeared. Of Wasp crew of 2,247 men and officers, 193 were killed outright or succumbed to their wounds. You're listening to The Veteran Next Door. I'm your host, Randy Baxter, and we'll be right back.
The Veteran Next Door will return in a moment.
Wasp was sunk by an American destroyer 5 hours after she was torpedoed and mortally wounded by a Japanese submarine, which probably did not get back to base to report the kill. The Navy, in telling of the carrier's loss September 15th, said the delay in announcement was caused by the probability that the enemy was unaware of her sinking. The Japanese had never claimed that the Wasp was sunk or even damaged. The submarine, which fired 3 torpedoes into the Wasp magazines and gasoline tanks, likely had no chance to report the success. The Wasp previously had beaten off attacks of planes and submarines of the other Axis powers, Germany and Italy, when she entered the Mediterranean earlier this year to deliver a supply of planes to the hard-pressed British garrison on Malta. From that mission, she escaped undamaged. But Tokyo had their own reports, too. Accompanying its version of Monday's sea-air battle, the Tokyo Radio Tuesday broadcast an Imperial Headquarters summary of alleged losses of the two sides in the Solomons area for the 2 months from August 25th to October 25th. That's 2 days from the date this paper was published, admitting for the first time the loss of 17 Japanese warships and transports. The summary said 22 American warships and transports had been sunk in that period. A total of 28, including Monday's action north of Santa Cruz Islands. Included in the list was the aircraft carrier Wasp, which the Navy announced Monday had been sunk September 15th by submarine. Tokyo added that 8 additional United States ships had been damaged in August 25th to October 25th period, a total of 13, including the Monday action. Listed as sunk by the Japanese from August 25th to October 25th were the Wasp, 3 United States cruisers, 5 destroyers, 6 submarines, 6 transports, and a minesweeper. Listed and damaged in the same period by the Japanese were United States battleship, 2 aircraft carriers, 1 cruiser, 1 submarine, 2 transports, and a minesweeper. Including Monday's battle, the Japanese claimed that 7 United States aircraft carriers had been sunk or damaged since August 25th. Well, we only had 7 to start with. More carriers than the United States Navy acknowledges are in commission since the loss of the Lexington and Yorktown in the Coral Sea in the Midway battles. The Japanese admitted only 2 cruisers, 2 destroyers, a submarine, and 5 transports of theirs were sunk between August 25th and October 25th. 1 Japanese cruiser, 3 destroyers, a submarine, and 5 transports were damaged in the same period, the Japanese said, including the 3 damaged in the Santa Cruz battle. That was a total of 13. In the October 25th report, from August 25th to October 25th, Tokyo claimed 403 United States planes were shot down and 97 destroyed on the ground, while 19 flying fortresses had been heavily damaged. Admitted Japanese airplane losses for the period were 104, including 28 which hurled themselves with their bomb loads into the enemy. There were 3 Knoxvillians on the USS Wasp on that day, September 15th. I want to take you back to a little bit in the story when I told you about the officer had given orders to throw the mattresses and the pillows off into the ocean to use as floating devices. And a story about Don Avery Elliott, age 19. He was one of the 3 Knoxville survivors of the Wasp. And here's a story he told. We saw a small sailor who had thrown a mattress over the side jump in after it and use it as a raft. He was floating around the ocean on that mattress, sitting there with his legs crossed, singing, deep in the heart of Texas. You know, the guys on the ship were pretty much young men. And one of the other articles that I had mentioned earlier in the show was that Congress was talking about or debating whether to lower the draft age from age 20 to age 18. And as I was reading through this newspaper, I saw in the corner a little cartoon by a man named Rube Goldberg. I don't know if you know him, but he was a cartoonist for the New York Times in the 40s and 50s and probably 60s. I don't know the exact dates. But inside his cartoon, you can imagine a closet with a closet door. And inside the closet door, there was a tennis racket, a baseball bat, and 2 baseballs, football, and a cowboy hat, a couple of sweaters with the school logo on it, and the door half closed. And next to that closet was a full metal helmet, a World War II carbine, a canteen, and a backpack. And the caption on the cartoon just had one word, and all it said was 18. You're listening to The Veteran Next Door. I'm your host, Randy Baxter, and we'll be right back.
The Veteran Next Door will return in a moment.
I'll talk to you a little bit about the book I've written, The Veteran Next Door, 1939 to 1946. It's interesting how sales are going on the book. I'm getting orders for 4, 5, and 6 copies for a family. And people are starting to say, I want my children to learn about World War II without all the battles and without all the generals and everything. Just learn about World War II from the people who were involved. You can go to Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble and order the book, but for the same price and get autographed copies for you and or members of your family. You can call my office at 865-525-2323 and get your autographed copy today. Just call 865-525-2323.
Now back to The Veteran Next Door.
The initial battles of Guadalcanal and the naval battle that ensued before it were great battles. Everybody was on their seats wondering what was going to go on, and you wonder about all the assets that we were using. We talked about the value of that ship was $20,737,000, which is a drop in the bucket in today's dollars. But there were other things going on at the Battle at Guadalcanal. The fight for Henderson Field was raging. I've read stories in this same newspaper about a young soldier who had been hit in the leg with a sword, and he turned around, and there was a Japanese officer getting ready to swing at him again, and he didn't know what to do, so he stuck his bayonet in him. And we've talked about George Harper, who came in and during that battle, who had been shot in the chest and stopped the bleeding by putting his finger in his chest as he walked back to the hospital ship. So all these things were going on, and all these assets were being expended. And what I'm about to read you was an article in this same newspaper that we've been talking about this whole show, about a father who had written a letter to his son 3 months before the ship sunk. Arlington, Massachusetts. Jackie Shea, 5 years old, has a letter he will never part with. A letter that said, "If I don't get back." It's from his dad, Commander John J. Shea, 43. Last seen fighting flames aboard the aircraft carrier Wasp shortly before the vessel went down under a torpedo attack near the Solomons, September 15th. Shea is listed as missing in action. The letter, written June 29th, reads in part, "Dear Jackie, this is the first letter I've ever written directly to my little son, and I am thrilled to know you can read it all by yourself. It is too bad this war could not have been delayed a few more years so that I could grow up again with you and do all the things I planned to do when you were old enough to go to school. I thought how nice it would be for me to come home early in the afternoon and play ball with you and go mountain climbing and see the trees and brooks and learn all about woodcraft and hunting, fishing, swimming, and other things like that. When you're a little bigger, you will know why your daddy is not home so much anymore. You know we have a big country, and we have ideals as to how people should live and enjoy the riches of it, and how each is born with equal rights to life, freedom, and a pursuit of happiness. Unfortunately, there are some countries in the world where they don't have these same ideals, where a boy cannot grow up and be what he wants to be. Fighting for the defense of our country, ideals, homes, and honor is an honor and a duty which your daddy has to do before he can come home to settle down with you and mother. Don't ever be a quitter, either in sports or in your business or profession when you grow up. Get all the education you can. Stay close to mother and follow her advice. Obey her in everything, no matter how much you may at times disagree. She knows what is best and will never let you down or lead you away from the right and honorable things of life. If I don't get back, you will have to be your mother's protector, because you will be the only one she has. You know, that's a sad and wonderful story about the USS Wasp. You know, I didn't make it up. It was headlines in the Milwaukee Journal, October 27, 1942. But I took some of the information from a magazine. I have hundreds of these magazines in my office called World War II. And this story that I've been reading from and talking to you about came out of the July 1991 edition of World War II, and it was written by Eric Hamill. He did all the research, and he needs to have all the credit for the material in this story. But his story came from an article that was taken out by World War II magazine in a chapter of his book called Guadalcanal, The Carrier Battles. So remember, as I said earlier today, on October 10th, 1845, was the first day of the founding of the Naval Academy of the United States of America. 98 years later, out in the Pacific, those officers from that academy were in the Lexington, the Yorktown, the Hornet, the Enterprise, the Ranger, the Saratoga, and the Wasp, and all their protecting vessels. And I guess the best way to end this show this week is to remind you once again about the letter that you just heard to little Jackie, 5 years old. You're listening to The Veteran Next Door. I'm your host, Randy Baxter, and we'll see you next week.
I never was a soldier, but I played one as a child. History was good to me. I grew up free and wild.
You've been listening to Randall Baxter and the Veteran Next Door.